Now I'd like to invite all of the panel back so that we can begin our discussion. And just before that, a reminder to everyone, if you have questions, to put them in on the chat session of your Q&A there on your Zoom call. So now we're inviting all of the panel back. Thank you all very much for joining us this evening. I think you've stimulated a lot of thought and a lot of questions coming through as well. So we might not get through them all, but I'm going to start off. And maybe now we'll start on the more historical aspect, maybe for Harriet and Ida. Is there a repository of vaccine preventable disease stories that can be shared and used as reminders to keep vaccinating? How can we communicate? Will the narrative help?
Well, I work as an oral historian trying to collect histories of about damage done to people by infectious disease, but particularly on infectious diseases of childhood. I think also that the stories, the oral histories I've collected from the 1918 flu are really effective in persuading people not just of the immediate damage, but of the lifelong damage, like a long COVID that the 1918 flu did as well. And I think there's quite good research evidence to show that a combination of statistical and medical information about infectious disease alongside oral histories or narratives helps to persuade people. So like I think, you know, we do need to storify these things to persuade people to keep getting vaccinated. I don't know of any single repository, but maybe Harriet might know.
No, I mean, I agree with what Ida said. It's really important to collect these things. I don't think there is a single repository for this kind of stuff. We have some examples in the college collections, and it's something that I talked to Ida about very early on, was collecting stories of this pandemic, and we are doing that, and we have a call out for anyone working in healthcare to submit their experiences so that we will have those first-hand accounts for future researchers and I guess future discussions like this.
There is much literature written about it, and some of them do have oral testimonies in them already. You know, you find you could fill a shelf or two with vaccination, popular books about vaccination. So it is a very big selling book thing. You know, it's popular sales.
And you've done a lot of work on vaccine hesitancy. Are we communicating right, or do we need these stories out there?
I think, as Ida and Harriet said, narrative is incredibly important for healthcare providers to give the message to parents and to those who are making the decision about vaccination. And it's one of the key things that can persuade people to make that decision to vaccinate. We've seen that with HPV. We've also seen it with other pediatric vaccines. I guess globally, France is the most vaccine hesitant country in the world, and there is some research from there that the narrative, that providing a narrative can make a slight difference. Obviously in France there's other issues as well, and I think this is an issue that even with scientists as well as healthcare providers struggle with a bit. Is, you know, I mean, for scientists we're very numerical based, and telling somebody that there's a percentage risk of side effects, but the percentage chance of you being protected is a certain amount. It doesn't work with some people, and we need to figure out ways of being better at storytelling and better at providing narrative. And I think that's where Ida and Harriet's work and other people in the humanities are very good at we need to open up and listen to those stories and provide those. So it is hugely important. And I think for in Ireland, we have a very good vaccine uptake, as you're aware of, Karina, in particular. And it is a question of just topping that up to the final, like 90-95%. And it'll be interesting to see with the COVID vaccine how that works.
Yes. So I think we need the narrative, but it needs to be based on the science and the evidence as well, so that we're giving the true narrative. And exactly. I think, Luke, this might be for you. Can you give an update on immunity testing and an explanation of the apparent failure of the widespread usefulness of antibody tests to date? We've all been beset a little bit by that. Can we improve on our antibody testing?
I think people misunderstood immunology, to be honest with you, to some extent, because the antibody will always wane, mainly, you know. if we'd loads of antibodies in our blood the whole time, your blood would be chock full of antibodies from your lifetime infection, remember? So that was the first thing. So the whole idea of zero prevalence, it's important to do it scientifically, really, you know, but not necessarily to inform people of changing their behavior or whatever. That was never going to be useful, we don't think. And if anything, I think maybe as Anne maybe said as well, the T cell bit is just as important, probably, you know. So the antibody measurement thing, it's not seen as that useful necessarily as an approach, you know. I think really antigen testing is much more the thing to talk about now in a way, you know, because it's a rapid test and hoping to be more reliable, you see. And so the prediction is there's so much effort going into testing, it's unbelievable. Remember, every big drug company has a massive diagnostics division, remember. So they've all deployed their abilities now towards testing, and the optimistic view would be within 2, 3, 4 months. Maybe that's hard to put a date on it, but certainly there'll be much more effective home-based testing will happen. And that'll be a much more important weapon that we can use. As I said, it's very strange watching yourself give a talk, isn't it, Ida? I've never done that before. But Chinese, how can the Chinese test 9 million people in 4 days? Would you explain that to me? You know, do it. That's twice the population of Ireland.
Okay, well, I suppose leaving the antibodies to one side, but if we do get a COVID vaccine, the question has come in, how long will the COVID vaccine will take to have an influential effect on the human body once given to a person? So when can we expect protection after we get it? And there was another question, I'll join them both together, and how long can we expect that to last? Or will we have to give serial vaccinations?
I'm sure Anne can have a go at that as well, but I'll have a go first. The vaccine isn't like the natural infection. It's really important to point that out. And even if there is reinfection with the natural infection, that doesn't mean it's going to happen with the vaccine. The reason being, it's not able to manipulate the immune system because it's attenuated or it's a subunit or whatever it might be. And then you're also giving an adjuvant. Now, in the phase 2 trials, for example, the AstraZeneca vaccine, they got a 3-fold enhancement over natural infection in the antibody level, for instance. So this is what you want a vaccine to do, basically. It's not like a natural infection. Now, the other thing to say would be, we don't know how long this for. And it's not going to be like flu, we think, because the virus hopefully isn't changing that much. You may need a booster, of course. The J&J vaccine is a single-shot vaccine, interestingly, so we'll see how that one pans out. But it's very empirical. I mean, it's going to be a suck-it-and-see job, really. We won't know until it's actually deployed.
Yeah. I think it is. I mean, everything that Luke says is absolutely accurate. I mean, it really does depend on the durability of the vaccine. It probably is likely that we'll have to give at least 2 immunizations. And I guess one thing that I'm thinking about at the moment is that we will know from the phase 3 trials if it works, and we can license it and start using it. But I guess the second kind of cohort of people that we're going to try and immunize are the vulnerable and the elderly. And as we all know, their immune systems are not as robust as healthcare workers and the general population. So I wonder if we will have to give multiple immunizations in the vulnerable. Hopefully not. Hopefully we'll have a fantastic vaccine that will work after 1, probably 2 shots. But we're in uncharted territory where we don't know actually what is the threshold level of immunity that's needed to keep you protected. And until we have kind of good immune assays and understanding the population, what's the kind of antibody titer or the number of T cells that you need to keep you protected, we don't know how long you'll stay protected until we can measure it.
Okay. There are a few questions coming in, slightly different, but all on a theme. And it is, do the panel have concerns about the rapidity of vaccine development? Can we be reassured that these are going to be safe? How can we develop confidence to take these vaccines if they become available? So who would like to take that one?
So I guess the rapidity is largely due to the fact that there's so much resources being ploughed into vaccine development. Normally, every other vaccine development that I've been involved with, you are constantly going back to look for funding to go on to the next step of your vaccine development, be it a repeated phase 1 or going into a phase 2 trial. And it really is about having the confidence to mitigate risk of the vaccine failing before you go through to the next stage. Whereas with the time is of the essence for COVID-19 vaccine, and that has been prioritized over finances. So a huge amount of finances has been plowed into decreasing the time, but that doesn't prevent us from looking at safety. And you have to let the trials go for a sufficient amount of time to understand the safety signals. So it's not the fact that the rapidity and the acceleration of developing a vaccine is because everything is happening in parallel rather than sequentially, which is what normally happens when you for the next vaccine. But the safety is still absolute priority. It is a key primary endpoint of primary and secondary endpoint of all of these trials. So it has to, and we've seen with one or two trials, Johnson & Johnson stopped their trial yesterday, AstraZeneca did already, and it all comes back to safety. So I think if a vaccine is licensed, I think that there's enough, there's sufficient transparency of safety, reactogenicity, that everybody can see what these vaccines can do with respect to efficacy and reactogenicity. And I'd be first in the queue to get that vaccine. I would have no qualms about being vaccinated with anything that is licensed. So I don't know, I'm sure Luke has some comments.
Yeah, I think you're right. Everything answers right. I mean, there's never been a spotlight on vaccine development like this before, remember, and all the big pharma are very well aware of this. They're being scrutinized hugely. And the big fear people have had is if there is a safety signal, it'll stop people vaccinating with other diseases, and suddenly the whole world is in a bad place. So safety has to be absolutely the top priority here. Even, you know, efficacy is the other thing, of course, but so they're very aware of this, and I'm happy to see adverse events stop on trials. It's a good sign, because it means we monitored very carefully, you know. And so I think it'll be very zealous, the safety regimen that they're going to use. It rushed. Well, it's certainly the fastest vaccine development program ever. But then again, they've got fantastic ways. I mean, the sophistication of the Johnson & Johnson trial is striking. They're measuring every variable in those people they can think of for any hint of any safety issues. So I would have no qualms at all that if the FDA and the EMA approve a vaccine, I'll take it immediately. And I'd suggest everybody should as well, you know.
Okay.
I guess then it's a question of the vaccine confidence of communicating that message to people in a way that they will accept and trust the answer that we give.
Okay. Another question coming in on a slightly different note, and this is about the virus and our current PCR testing. And I suppose with the prolonged at times detection of viral remnants, the question is, how do we know whether it's due to virus activity replicating, i.e. that it's infectious, or just leftover bits on the body's immune response and that they're no longer infectious? How can we determine infectivity?
There's a big effort into that, Mary. I mean, that's a massive focus at the moment, because obviously the PCR test is so sensitive. They're trying to get a CT value that will predict infectivity, right? And I think it might be around 35, I read today, for instance, that the CT is 35. So if you're higher than that, you will amplify this virus from water. You pick up if you've amplified enough, you know? It doesn't mean that's an infectious source at all. And then it could be remnants, it could be pieces of RNA. So this is the disadvantage of that PCR test. It doesn't do anything about infectivity, it's all read. But you do, obviously, the more virus that's there, the more likely it is it's going to be infectious. And they're going to try to get a handle on a standardized CT value to say, look, that's definitely an infectious case. If it's above that, that is not infectious, is the idea. And that's hard to do. The CT values differ between labs, the protocols differ a bit. But it's an important question. Now, on the other hand, as I showed in my talk, you do need case numbers to give you some kind of idea of predicting hospitalizations anyway. And even if they aren't all infectious, it's still an important number to get. So it's a bit imprecise, but it's not the worst thing to have in a way. But we have to move towards a better test that will be indicative of infectivity, I think, and they're trying to head in that direction.
Okay. I'm just going to move away from the, if you like, the direct science, and a question for everybody. Are there stories in the past about enforcing vaccines through legal measures, i.e. mandatory vaccination? And what are the panelists' views on enforcing vaccines in this way? So I think that's a very pertinent question, and I know you talked on it a little bit in the earlier talks of mandatory vaccination. Is that something that should be considered? Who would like to talk to that? Ida?
Do you want to, Ida?
I suppose in historic terms, there were trials done, for example, on children who really wouldn't have been capable of doing consent for various drugs in the past, but now that would be considered completely unethical. The rest of the question probably pertains more to the scientists than to me.
Yeah, I guess when it comes to mandatory vaccines, it's there are quite a number of vaccines that are mandated across Europe. But I suppose there's two things. Mandatory is if that's actually enforced or not, and the consequences of enforcing vaccination. I don't know of any European body that's actually enforced it, gone ahead and enforced vaccines on people. The flu vaccine is actually mandated in some countries as well for healthcare professionals, but again, it's not enforced. And I think it is, there have been quite a lot of studies done in the US looking at what would be the most effective way of increasing flu vaccination in healthcare professionals and mandating it. They've found, a lot of studies are showing that mandating vaccines, but practically, I don't think that's the way forward. It has to be by consent, and people have to want to take that vaccine. So even though theoretically it might have an effect, it actually has an opposite effect. In France, anytime that they've brought in enforced vaccination or mandated vaccination, it hasn't worked. It's actually been a knee-jerk reaction against that vaccine then. So mandatory vaccination is actually, there's one thing about saying we'll make it mandated, but there's another thing about actually trying to do that. And I don't think there's anything good to be said about mandating vaccines. It's not going to work in a European context anyway.
Okay.
I think a better policy is to exclude people. So in other words, you're a part of our society. If your child isn't vaccinated, they can't go to school. Or you might say, if you don't have an immunity stamp on your passport, a bit like we have already kind of, you can't travel, then that isn't making something illegal. It's not mandating it. It's just your decision. You're a free citizen. You can decide not to vaccinate or vaccinate your child, but there has to be consequences for our society if you do that. So therefore, you might get excluded. That was a second strategy that was used. I might know more if that's ever worked, mind you, as well. But certainly to force people, it won't work, either. Will it?
Yeah, I think the vaccinating, excluding children has kind of socioeconomic consequences for those families. And considering it's a child and they don't have consent,
exactly.
They can,
unsound.
Exactly. So it's
adults traveling, you think that might be an option for adults, to stay.
I mean, that's, as an adult, you're consenting and you're making the choice that you can't travel. So maybe that might be one option. Definitely, when it comes to pediatric vaccines, it's not a good way forward.
From the questions coming in, I know we could talk about this all evening because there really is so much, but I think we're going to just have time for 2 more questions. So here's an interesting one. Is it possible to test the entire population and then have policies based on COVID negative and COVID positive to prevent functional paralysis of our society? Should we be streaming everybody as to whether they're COVID positive or COVID negative? And I suppose that might reflect on limitations of testing as well. Any thoughts on that?
That's the Chinese way. We're testing 9 million people in that city at the moment, to try to do that. So it's a bit logistical, I guess. But the dream would be to have widespread testing, obviously, as much as possible. And then isolation of those who are positive. And that's a much better way to do it than to lock the whole nation down. If this continues, and even though we're optimistic about a vaccine, if we get into the middle of next year, can you imagine anybody for a minute we're in the same position in 12 months' time? Won't that be unthinkable? We'll need to have a much more effective test, trace, isolate system in place by then for definite as a way to control this and as widespread testing as possible. One dream is, instead of being sent iodine tablets, you'll be sent 10 little test strips, that will work for you in your house, and you can spit and see if you're positive. That's the kind of direction that has to go in.
And maybe this is an interesting one to think about as we end up. My granddad and his sister appeared in a school play in 1918. Every other child in the play got Spanish flu. He didn't. I had a similar experience when my husband's family all got COVID and I didn't after being exposed. Could some of us be immune thanks to our genetics?
We'd love to get that person's DNA.
Okay, we'll have to ask that person. That is a really interesting question, I think, I have to say, because it's not just in this, but also in the inflammatory responses to COVID as to why some people will spiral off into an inflammatory cascade and why some don't. And there's no doubt some of us probably have more happy genes in that regard. I won't say better genes, but different genes that keep us protected. I think we're literally coming to the close of our evening. I really apologize to those whose questions I didn't get to. It's no reflection. There have really been questions that could have kept us talking all night. The reality is we don't have the answers to a lot of these questions. They're good questions, but that's what everyone like Luke, like Anne, like everybody is working on to get those answers so that we can steer our way safely through this pandemic. I'm going to hand back now to Mary to say a few words from the college.
Thanks very much, and thanks to our historians and scientists. So I'm going to end up with a message of hope, and it's really based on what the historians have told us. We have lived through many, many pandemics over the millennia, and we have come out the other end. We've come out the other end because of science, investigation into what's happening, and our understanding on the behaviours that can control it. So pandemics have either faded away or we control them. And it's only a matter of time that happens with coronavirus. This is a great start to our annual conference. I look forward to our masterclass tomorrow evening at 5 o'clock. And in the meantime, stay safe.